Sienna God, hello all. Good afternoon, and Wado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 4 of reading Propaganda by Edward Bernays, and this is part C. All right. It is true that the church appeals to our religious impulses and that everybody loves the spring, but these impulses do not help to sell the idea that hockey skates are amusing, helpful, or increase the general enjoyment of life for the buyer. Present-day politics places emphasis on personality, an entire party, a platform, and international policy is sold to the public, or it is not sold on the basis of the intangible element of personality. A charming candidate is the alchemist's secret that can transmute a prosaic platform into the gold of votes. Helpful as is a candidate who for some reason has caught the imagination of the country, the party and its aims are certainly more important than the personality of the candidate. Not personality, but the ability of the candidate to carry out the party's program adequately, and the program itself should be emphasized in a sound campaign plan. Even Henry Ford, the most picturesque personality in business in America today, has become known throughout his product, and not his product through him. It is essential for the campaign manager to educate the emotions in terms of groups. The public is not made up merely of Democrats and Republicans. People today are largely uninterested in politics, and their interest in the issues of the campaign must be secured by coordinating it with their personal interests. The public is made up of interlocking groups: economic, social, religious, educational, cultural, racial, collegiate, local, sports, and hundreds of others. When President Coolidge invited actors for breakfast, he did so because he realized not only that actors were a group, but that audience is the large group of people who like amusements, who like people who amuse them, and who like people who can be amused, ought to be aligned with him. The Shepherd-Towner, Towner, maternity bill was passed because the people who fought to secure its passage realized that mothers made up a group, that educators made up a group, that physicians made up a group, that all these groups in turn influence other groups, and that taken all together, these groups were sufficiently strong and numerous to impress Congress with the fact that the people at large wanted this bill to be made part of the national law. The political campaign, having defined its broad objects and its basic plans, having defined the group appeal which it must use, must carefully allocate to each of the media at hand the work which it can do with maximum efficiency. The media through which a political campaign may be brought home to the public are numerous and fairly well defined. Events and activities must be created in order to put ideas into circulation, and these channels, which are as varied as the means of human communication. Every object which presents pictures or words that the public can see, everything that presents intelligible sounds can be utilized in one way or another. At present, the political campaigner uses for the greatest part the radio, the press, the banquet hall, the mass meeting, the lecture platform, and the stump, generally as a means. I'm learning that they use all these words to describe different deals that I'm just like, I never knew it like that. But anyway, I don't know what the stump means. What does that mean? Anyway, and this was in 1928, so I don't even know if they would still refer to it as that, whatever that may be. Generally as a means for furthering his ideas, but this is only a small part of what may be done. Actually, there are infinitely more varied events that can be created to dramatize the campaign and to make people talk of it. Exhibitions, contest institutes of politics, the cooperation of educational institutions, the dramatic cooperation of groups which hitherto have not been drawn into active politics, and many others may be made the vehicle for the presentation of ideas to the public. Would a podium be considered a stump? I don't know. But whatever is done must be synchronized accurately with all other forms of appeal to the public. News reaches the public through the printed workbooks, magazines, letters, posters, circulars, and banners. Newspapers through pictures, photographs, and motion pictures. Through the ear, lectures, speeches, band, music, radio, campaign songs. All these must be campaign songs. Yes. All these must be employed by the political party. Everybody's got a jingle, a ditty. Anyway, if it ditty, D-I-T-T-Y, not ditty, D-I-D-D-Y. You know what I mean? Not that dude. All these must be employed by the political party if it is to succeed. One method of appeal is merely one method of appeal, and in this age wherein 1,000 movements and ideas are competing for public attention, one dare not put all one's eggs into one basket. It is understood that the methods of propaganda can be effective only with a voter who makes up his own mind, oh yeah, on the basis of his group prejudices and desires. I gotta fix this table leg. Anyway, where specific allegiances and loyalties exist, as in the case of boss leadership, these loyalties will operate to nullify the free will of the voter. In this close relation between the boss and his constituents lies, of course, the strength of his position in politics. Back then, I'm pretty sure, I don't know, I wasn't alive then, but I'm just saying, I knew that when I went to go vote, like when I was younger with my parents or whatever, like, or then by myself, eventually when I was 18, that you could have votes across the board, whether it was Republican, Democrat, Independent, or you can like write somebody in or whatever. Now you're relegated to only Republican or Democrat, and there's no independent category or whatever, and it's really messed up, because if I want somebody who's in another bracket, I can't put him in there, you know? And I can't like write his name or her name in, like type it in or whatever, when that area comes up. Anyway, that specific area, there's no write-in. It's really weird. Anyways. In this close relation between the boss and his constituents lies, of course, the strength of his opposition in politics. It is not necessary for the politician to be the slave of the public's group prejudices. If he can learn how to mold the mind of the voters in conformity with his own ideas of public welfare and public service, the important thing for the statesmen of our age is not so much to know how to please the public, but to know how to sway the public. In theory, this education might be done by means of learned pamphlets explaining the intricacies of public questions. In actual fact, it can be done only by meeting the conditions of the public mind, by creating circumstances which set up trains of thought, by dramatizing personalities, by establishing contact with the group leaders who control opinions of their publics. But campaigning is only an incident in political life. The process of government is continuous, and the expert use of propaganda is more useful and fundamental, although less striking, as an aid to democratic administration than as an aid to vote getting. Good government can be sold to community just as any other commodity can be sold. I often wonder whether the politicians of the future who are responsible for maintaining the prestige and effectiveness of their party will not endeavor to train politicians who are at the same time propagandists. I talked recently with George Olvany, Olvany. He said that a certain number of Princeton men were joining Tammany, Tammany Hall, Tammany Hall. If I were in his place, I should have taken some of my brightest young men and set them to work for Broadway theatrical productions, or apprenticed them as assistants to professional propagandists before recruiting them to the service of the party. One reason, perhaps, why the politician today is slow to take up methods which are commonplace in business life is that he has such ready entry to the media of communication on which his power depends. The newspaper man looks to him for news, and by his power of giving or withholding information, the politician can often effectively censor political news. But being dependent every day of the year and for year after year, well, same difference, upon certain politicians for news, the newspaper reporters are obliged to work in harmony with their news sources. The political leader must be a creator of circumstances, not only a creature of mechanical processes of stereotyping and rubber stamping. Let us suppose that he is campaigning on a lower tariff form. He may use the modern mechanism of the radio to spread his views, but he will almost certainly use the psychological method of approach which was old in Andrew Jackson's day, and which business has largely discarded. He will say over the radio, vote for me and low tariff, because the high tariff increases the cost of the things you buy. He may, if it's true, have the great advantage of being able to speak by radio directly to 50 million listeners. Oh my gosh, okay, so that's the same thing as, if you don't vote for me, you're not black. That doesn't make any sense. Oh my gosh. But you know what? It worked, right? Anyway, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Ugh, James. Okay. Advantage of being able to speak by radio directly to 50 million listeners, but he is making an old-fashioned approach. He is arguing with them. He is assaulting single-handed the resistance of inertia. If he were a propagandist, on the other hand, although he would still use the radio, he would use it as one instrument of a well-planned strategy. Since he is campaigning on the issue of a low tariff, he not merely would tell people that the high tariff increases the cost of the things they buy, but would create circumstances which would make his contention dramatic and self-evident. He would perhaps stage a low tariff exhibition simultaneously in 20 cities, with exhibits illustrating the additional costs due to the tariff in force. He would see that these exhibitions were ceremoniously inaugurated by prominent men and women who were interested in a low tariff apart from any interest in his personal political fortunes. He would have groups whose interests were especially affected by the high cost of living, institute an agitation for lower schedules. He would dramatize the issue, perhaps by having prominent men boycott woolen clothes and go to important functions in cotton suits until the wool schedule was reduced. He might get the opinion of social workers as to whether the high cost of wool endangers the health of the poor in winter. In whatever ways he dramatized the issue, the attention of the public would be attracted to the question before he addressed them personally. Then, when he spoke to his millions of listeners on the radio, he would not be seeking to force an argument down the throats of a public thinking of other things and annoyed by another demand on its attention. On the contrary, he would be answering the spontaneous questions and expressing the emotional demands of a public already keyed to a certain pitch of interest in the subject. The importance of taking the entire world public into consideration before planning an important event is shown by the wise action of Thomas Masaryk, then provisional president, now president of the Republic of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia officially became a free state on Monday, October 28, 1918, instead of Sunday, October 27, 1918, because Professor Masaryk, Masaryk, realized that the people of the world would receive more information and would be more receptive to the announcement of the Republic's freedom on a Monday morning than on a Sunday, because the press would have more space to devote to it on Monday morning. Discussing the matter with me before he made the announcement, Professor Masaryk said, in quotes, "I would be making history for the cables if I changed the date of Czechoslovakia's birth as a free nation," end quote. Cables make history, and so the date was changed. This incident illustrates the importance of technique in the new propaganda. It will be objected, of course, that propaganda will tend to defeat itself as its mechanism becomes obvious to the public. My opinion is that it will not. The only propaganda which will ever tend to weaken itself as the world becomes more sophisticated and intelligent is propaganda that it is untrue or unsocial. Well, they're just eating all that up, ain't they now? They're just beating that dead horse, just trying to like squeeze all the blood out of that turnip, right? Anyway, milking that turnip. Jesus. Again, the objection is raised that propaganda is utilized to manufacture our leading political personalities. It is asked whether, in fact, the leader makes propaganda or whether propaganda makes the leader. There is a widespread impression that a good press agent can puff up a nobody into a great man. Well, that's sad. The answer is the same as that made to the old query as to whether the newspaper makes public opinion or whether public opinion makes the newspaper. There has to be fertile ground for the leader and the idea to fall on, but the leader has to have some vital seed to sow. To use another figure, a mutual need has to exist before either can become positively effective. Propaganda is of no use to the politician unless he has something to say which the public continuously or unconsciously wants to hear. But even supposing that a certain propaganda is untrue or dishonest, we cannot, on that account, reject the methods of propaganda as such. For propaganda is in some form will always be used where leaders need to appeal to their constituencies. The criticism is often made that propaganda tends to make the President of the United States so important that he becomes not the president but the embodiment of the idea of hero worship. Yeesh. Not to say deity worship. I quite agree that this is so. But how are you going to stop a condition which very accurately reflects the desires of a certain part of the public? The American people rightly senses the enormous importance of the executive's office if the public tends to make of the president a heroic symbol of that power. That is not the fault of the propaganda, but lies in the very nature of the office and its relation to the people. Oh man, this condition, despite its somewhat irrational puffing up of the man to fit the office, is perhaps still more sound than a condition in which the man utilizes no propaganda, or a propaganda not adapted to its proper end. Note the example of the Prince of Wales. This young man reaped bales of clippings and little additional glory from his American visit, merely because he was poorly advised. To the American public, he became a well-dressed, charming, sport-loving, dancing, perhaps frivolous youth. Nothing was done to add dignity and prestige to this impression until towards the end of his stay, he made a trip in the subway of New York. This sole venture into democracy and the serious business of living, as evidenced in the daily habit of workers, aroused new interest in the prince. Had he been properly advised, he would have augmented this somewhat by such serious studies of American life as were made by another prince, Gustav of Sweden, Gustave. As a result of the lack of well-directed propaganda, the Prince of Wales became, in the eyes of the American people, not the thing which he constitutionally is, a symbol of the unity of the British Empire, but part and parcel of sporting Long Island and dancing beauties of the ballroom. Great Britain lost an invaluable opportunity to increase the goodwill and understanding between the two countries when it failed to understand the importance of correct public relations. Counsel for His Royal Highness. The public actions of America's chief executive are, if one chooses to put it that way, stage managed. But they are chosen to represent and dramatize the man in his function as representative of the people, a political practice which has its roots in the tendency of the popular leader to follow oftener than he leads, is the technique of the trial ballroom, which he uses in order to maintain, as he believes, his contact with the public. The politician, of course, has his ear to the ground. It might be called the clinical ear. It touches the ground and hears the disturbances of the political universe. But he often does not know what the disturbances mean, rather whether they are superficial or fundamental. So he sends up his balloon. He may send out an anonymous interview through the press. He then waits for the reverberations to come from the public, a public which expresses itself in mass meetings or resolutions or telegrams, or even such obvious manifestations as editorials in the partisan or nonpartisan press. On the basis of these repercussions, he then publicly adopts his original tentative policy, or rejects it, or modifies it to conform to the sum of public opinion which has reached him. This method is modeled on the peace feelers, which were used during the war to sound out the disposition of the enemy to make peace, or to test any one of a dozen other popular tendencies. It is the method commonly used by a politician before committing himself to legislation of any kind, and by a government before committing itself on foreign or domestic policies. It is a method which has little justification. If a politician is a real leader, he will be able to, by the skillful use of propaganda, to lead the people instead of following the people by means of the clumsy instrument of trial and error. The propagandist approach is the exact opposite of that of the politician just described. The whole basis of successful propaganda is to have an objective and then to endeavor to arrive at it through an exact knowledge of the public and modifying circumstances to manipulate and sway that public. In quotes, the function of a statesman, end quote, says George Bernard, B-E-N-A-R-D Shaw, in quotes, is to express the will of the people in the way of the scientist, end quote. The political leader of today should be a leader as finely versed in the technique of propaganda as in political economy and civics. If he remains merely the reflection of the average intelligence of his community, he might as well go out of politics. If one is dealing with a democracy in which the herd and the group follow those whom they recognize as leaders, why should not the young men training for leadership be trained in its technique as well as in its idealism? Till we meet again, love you, mean it.